There's probably at least a few of you out there who'd like to hear my thoughts on the LUMIX S5 Mark II compared to the new LUMIX GH7. We've got full frame LUMIX versus micro four thirds LUMIX. I've been shooting LUMIX forever, and I do own both these cameras, and I've been using them quite extensively over the past few months. But before we get into that, I do want to put a disclaimer up front. There's not going to be any footage or test examples or comparisons in this video. If you want to see that, there's plenty of test footage out there that you can go find from the company itself, LUMIX, Panasonic, as well as other YouTubers who have done that. There's a few reasons I don't necessarily think it's really all that valuable for me to add footage to this video. For one, it takes a whole lot more time to put that in there for something that's ultimately going to get compressed and watched on an iPhone. So most of the time you can't really tell the quality of the footage from YouTube anyway. And second of all, it almost always depends on what's being filmed. What is the content itself rather than the camera that shot it? So imagine if I'm out there filming X Games or Red Bull or some beautiful wedding, with a gorgeous couple and tons of decorations everywhere. It's going to look really, really good no matter what camera I'm using. You can see footage from 10 years ago that looks great because of what's in it, the subject matter itself. Nowadays, you can kind of get a sense of what a camera might be able to deliver, but Sony, LUMIX, Canon, DJI, they're all delivering exceptional imagery and quality. And so I want to talk more about what it's like to actually use these cameras. And I think that's more of just a conversation than anything I can visually show you without spending a ton of time on it for something that's, maybe only relevant to a handful of people. LUMIX is by far not the most popular cameras out there. So you're already talking to a smaller audience anyway. And even within that, people have probably already made up their mind of what they like. But I thought I'd just add my 2 cents because I have been using both of these cameras, the S5 Mark II and the GH7, for, I would say, enough projects, professional work for the past few months that I feel like I have some insights that you wouldn't get at first glance. I would say first and foremost for the S5 Mark II, that is my favorite. My clear winner between the two is the S5 Mark II. The main reason being is when you look at full frame, the noise that's captured is way less than micro four thirds. Forever, I've been shooting micro four thirds, and it's great. And I love the cameras, and I love the lenses, and I like the format. But when you're looking at raw footage, the S5 Mark II is a lot cleaner in terms of noise performance at the same ISO. And there's been a lot of people who have talked about this before. It's one of those things that doesn't really matter once it gets across the finish line. When you hit export and you upload and it gets compressed, all of that micro four thirds noise kind of disappears and you can't really see it in the final product. But when you're actually shooting the footage and you're acquiring it, it's just that sense of when I'm looking at the footage on the computer on the display, I like a really clean, nice, pleasing image, and the S5 Mark II does have that. It also has a little bit more dynamic range. So not necessarily like, the brightest of brights are going to be retained or the shadows are super clean, just the general gradations, the skin tone, there's a smoothness to the contrast, which is kind of hard to explain and can be visually demonstrated, but it's, again, one of those really minor, super small nitpick things that you probably might appreciate. I certainly do, but your end viewer, end user isn't really going to see or notice that difference. It's just a personal preference for me. So I do kind of prefer the S5 Mark II when it comes to just the quality of the image of the footage. I haven't had any issues with it in terms of overheating or the camera, cutting clips short. I haven't had any issues like that whatsoever. The only really gripe with the S5 Mark II is the annoying crop that you get when you're shooting 60 frames a second. I'm not doing that all the time, but there is a Super 35 APS-C crop when you shoot 60 frames in 4K on the S5 Mark II. That's something you don't really have to factor in if you're doing micro four thirds. So the GH7, the GH6, the G9 Mark II, all kind of the newer micro four thirds cameras from LUMIX, they don't really give you, crops. There's certain modes you can put it into, stabilization modes that will crop it. But when you're shooting 24 versus 60, that's not an issue where it is on the full frame camera, which understandably, it makes sense. So it's not a penalty against the S5 Mark II. Like I said, I still prefer it, but it's something that you always have to keep in the back of your head. Okay, when I'm shooting 60 frames, I'm just going to have a little bit more reach, which can be advantageous in some situations, but it is something to think about. You can't just switch to 60 and keep shooting with the same lens like you're used to for 24. You have to do kind of the mental math of, okay, I'm getting a crop factor now when I'm shooting 60. And ultimately you can work around that, and it's not that big of a deal. The 60 looks great. A lot of people have talked about rolling shutter on the S5 Mark II, and I haven't found it to be an issue. Granted, I'm not shooting action sports. I'm not shooting fast cars. I'm not doing crazy whip pans or anything like that. For my needs, the rolling shutter has not been an issue really at all for what I do. I do appreciate the stabilization. Like I said, the dynamic range, the quality of the footage is great. Now, when I would say the GH7 is nice because it basically adds phase detect autofocus, is really the biggest selling point for me when it comes to Micro Four Thirds. That was added on the G9 Mark II, but as I've talked about before, the G9 Mark II overheats in certain conditions that I wouldn't say are extreme. It's kind of like if you're filming in direct sunlight for an extended period of time, maybe a couple hours, which to me is kind of normal, the G9 Mark II will overheat. So for me, the G9 Mark II has become an indoor camera, kind of maybe if you're doing events, any kind of indoor like recipes or photography, certainly the G9 Mark II is great. But for video, it's not my go-to. That's the GH7. I did find an amazing deal on the GH7 used. I think it was like $1,000 off, and I thought it was going to be one of those scams, but where you can end up finding deals on newer cameras, it's kind of the best time to buy used. I don't know if that makes sense, but of course, years and years go by, and there's a lot of used cameras on the market. But a lot of cameras, when they're newly released, people will return them or they'll exchange them or whatever. So there's this like handful of used cameras, and if you're looking at something like LUMIX, which isn't the most popular, you can every once in a while score a really good used deal on something that's very lightly used. So I was fortunate enough to get the GH7 at a steep, steep discount through Amazon and their Amazon resale program. I feel like it was kind of a like lightning striking, basically. It's very rare. I wouldn't bet on it, but I do think the GH7 is kind of expensive, at least at the newly released MSRP retail kind of thing. I feel like for Micro Four Thirds, at least, it has to be under $2,000. I know there's a lot of features packed into these cameras, and people are saying this is, the pinnacle of technology. But when you're talking about fundamentals like sensor size, crop factors, all that kind of stuff, you're getting in that zone where you're comparing Micro Four Thirds to full frame, and the full frame cameras are cheaper. I think that's a hard sell in today's market. I wish the GH7 had come out at like a $1,800 price point, something like that, a little bit more palatable. I think mine was more like in the 1400s used, but I kind of got lucky with that. So I do like it at a lower price point. At full retail, brand new, that's a hard pill to swallow, but the camera is great. I would really compare it to a GH6. There's plenty of marketing out there that will tell you it's so much better and it's got all these cool features. But for me, when I'm looking at the footage, when I'm using it's the same exact body. Everything's the same. It does have a handful of features that are new, but almost all of them or most of them are paid upgrades. So you can do 32-bit float on the GH7, but I haven't done that yet because you need to buy the new XLR2 adapter, which is another like $500 or something like that. The GH7 can do ARRI C-Log. You can shoot with the ARRI Alexa, essentially, log profile, but that's also a $200 kind of paid upgrade. If I'm off on the math or the numbers on any of this, forgive me. It's all stuff I kind of wrote off because when I'm looking at the camera, I want to know what can you do for the price I'm buying, not, oh, yeah, just pay an extra $1,000 and you get all these other features. At that point, you might be considering an entirely different camera altogether, because if your budget increases by that much, maybe you are in the market for something a little bit, higher end, more expensive, that sort of thing. But I do really like the GH7, all things considered. I get to use all my great Micro Four Third glass, those lenses that I love, the 10-25, the 25-50, the 50-200, those Leica lenses are gorgeous. They're beautiful, and I do still use them often on the GH7 when I need that reach. That's kind of the power of Micro Four Thirds, is reach as well as compact size. So the other thing I like to do and where I use the GH7, it's kind of my I don't know, second camera that I can put all the places that I'm not fully rigging it out. So the S5 Mark II gets the LCD screen, it gets the bigger battery, it gets all the wires, the microphone, the wireless microphones, and like that's kind of my main rig is the S5 Mark II. And then the GH7 becomes my sort of B camera that I can get really cool wide shots with a small lens. I'll throw like the 9mm lens on there. It's a 1.7. I think it's a Leica lens, but it's a small little prime. Basically, that with the GH7 is a pretty small footprint that doesn't overheat. That's the big advantage of the GH7 compared to the G9 Mark II. And then, of course, compared to the GH6, the GH7 has phase detect autofocus. And I do really like it. It's pretty reliable. I'd say 95% reliable. Is it as good as Sony? No. The Sony is a little stickier to faces and eyeballs and that sort of thing. But in general, sometimes I would say the Lumix is better in certain scenarios because I found, and this might depend on the camera model. Sony has so many different camera bodies that do autofocus. They've been doing it for so long. Maybe there's cameras where you can adjust it. But in general, I find with the camera bodies I have access to, the Sonys tend to favor focusing on like the background, where Lumix tends to focus more on like the foreground, which can be irritating or not, depending on the situation. So there's plenty of times where I'm shooting with the Lumix, either the S5 Mark II or the GH7, and what I want in focus, there's like something kind of in the foreground obstructing a little bit, and the camera will prefer that foreground element. Whereas on the Sony, oftentimes I'll have something in the foreground that I want to focus on, but it's seeing detail and texture and stuff in the background, and it's focusing on that. These are the handful of like random times where the camera messes up. Most of the time, like I said, 95, 99% reliable. So in those instances where it is kind of wrong, the tendency for me in my experience has been one prefers one where the other prefers the opposite, which is kind of weird to work around. And I don't know, maybe there's a setting buried deep in the menus where you can optimize this stuff, but I haven't found that yet. So to get back to the conversation about the S5 Mark II compared to the GH7, I think both are great. And if you have, micro four thirds lenses, the GH7 is awesome. Kind of expensive if you're paying full price, but hopefully you can find a discount somewhere. If you're considering the GH7 or the S5 Mark II and you have a choice, I would say go with the S5 Mark II. It's probably the most happy I've been with a camera in a long time, considering it has phase detect autofocus, considering it is full frame, so you're getting that ultimate, kind of peak of image quality, at least at this price point and in this market. One thing I will say, though, is that when you're going from micro four thirds to full frame, a lot of people will talk about depth of field, and I actually prefer the depth of field of micro four thirds. Almost 9 times out of 10, full frame is too shallow, aside from like wide shots and if you really want to blur the background. But I personally find micro four thirds depth of field to be more pleasing at those shallow, the wider apertures. So if you're shooting like a 1.4, 1.7, anything f2 or lower, I tend to prefer micro four thirds because that extra depth of field, it's still shallow. The sensor is still bigger than your traditional, like the old school, really tiny sensor cameras, you like your 1/3-inch CCD chips and that sort of thing. Micro four thirds is way bigger than that. And so you will get shallow depth of field, but full frame, the depth of field can be annoyingly shallow. And this is something that I've talked about a lot in the past where people think it's cinematic or they think it looks like a movie because they're getting all that blur. And you end up looking at the footage or you're looking at the photos and it's all blur. Barely any is even in focus because the depth of field is just so shallow. So for me, full frame is not a depth of field war of like, oh, go full frame, you get the shallowest depth of field. It's the other things, like I said, the noise and the dynamic range are superior with that bigger sensor. So it is something to consider that you often will have to shoot if you're doing any kind of close-up detail, B-roll or anything like that, like the close-up stuff. You're going to need to shoot it like an f4, a 5.6, f8 is your aperture in a lot of situations to actually get enough in focus that you can even tell what it is. And this might be normal for people who are coming from full frame or who have been shooting full frame for a long time. But if you're shooting micro four thirds and you're used to all that like light gathering ability and you're shooting at like an f2 and you're able to film basically anything and everything because you just go and you set your exposure and you're good, I do find myself manipulating my aperture more on full frame, depending on the distance from my subject, depending if I'm getting close-ups or wide shots or whatever it might be. So that's a little bit more annoying to navigate in certain situations, but I do prefer that, just the cleaner, more dynamic range. And it is really sharp in terms of resolution on the S5 Mark II. I'm usually shooting 4K. You can shoot up to 6K, I believe, and there's a lot of different aspect ratios that you can film in. Of course, you can do open gate on LUMIX, but one thing I should mention, Micro Four Thirds, those sensors are 4:3. If you're shooting full frame LUMIX open gate, you're getting 3:2, which is normal for a photography perspective. But if you're using open gate like I am, one of the main advantages I think for open gate filmmaking is that you can get vertical and horizontal footage at the same time. Technically with 3:2, you're getting less vertical real estate than you are with 4:3. I don't know if that makes sense. It's kind of in the weeds, but it's just something to be aware of. If you're looking to go LUMIX full frame and get the S5 Mark II, and I believe all the other S cameras at this point, that full frame sensor is a 3:2 aspect ratio, which is less square than 4:3. I'm not aware of any camera that's true like 1:1, which is ultimately what I'd like to go towards, because after all, these lenses are capturing a perfect circle if they're spherical lenses, and that circle should be able to fill a square, and then that open gate would give you the most flexibility for horizontal and vertical filmmaking. Well, 3:2 gives you a little bit more room, so it's better than shooting 16:9, but it's not quite as advantageous as 4:3. I will say, to go back to a camera that I like probably the most for open gate production, it's the GH5 actually, and there's a really specific reason for that. The GH5 can shoot 24, 30, and 60 frames a second using the kind of full sensor size. So open gate, you're getting the full thing in all the frame rates. With the GH6, they implemented a change on the LUMIX cameras where open gate changes you do get a crop, I guess is the long and short of it. So when you're shooting 60 frames a second on the GH6, trying to shoot open gate, you're getting like 4.4K, I think. So it's technically a crop of the sensor. Whereas at 24 and 30, you're getting the full 6K, either 5.9K, 5.8K. I forget what they label it. But basically, the GH5 was the perfect open gate camera because none of the frame rates got cropped from the GH6. And I believe the GH7, G9 Mark II, everything I've used recently, you're dealing with different crops in open gate compared to the GH5, which was just like perfect. But of course, the GH5 didn't have phase detect. It had some other limitations. But in general, I like the LUMIX cameras because you're getting all these great, cool technical features that most other cameras just don't even offer. Things like open gate, things like shutter angle. That's one of the biggest ones that still to this day is not embraced widely across all these different hybrid style cameras. Shutter angle is huge, and it's one of the reasons I've stuck with LUMIX for so long. And I'm really happy with the S5 Mark II. I think it's a great camera. It's not necessarily my perfect camera. I do wish the 4K 60 mode wasn't cropped to Super 35, but it's, like I said, it's something I can deal with. But it is a nitpick. I would prefer something that didn't have that limitation. And I think really the only thing missing for me is something I've also talked a lot about, is having a camera with a built-in electronic variable ND. At this point in time, these cameras all do more or less the same stuff. So even image quality, color science, all that, where people are really pixel peeping, but like we're not arguing over 1080 versus 4K anymore. That used to be the fight. And, for the longest time, Canon was still putting out cameras that didn't shoot 4K or didn't shoot it in a way that was easily accessible. For a while, people were going towards Sony because of the autofocus and being so much better, but all the other manufacturers have caught up now. So it's more or less an even level playing field. You might have lenses that you've invested in, so you want to stay in a certain ecosystem, and that's totally fine because at the end of the day, everyone's offering log. Everything now is 10-bit 422 at least, usually for the most part. So now I'm looking for those more advanced features, like something that actually changes the way I do production, which for me would be an internal ND system, not a mechanical filter. I think there's not enough room inside these mounts for that sort of thing, but I think you could fit an electronic ND in there, because there are a handful of cameras that have, but they're more cinema style cameras, which you can say they're better. I personally don't prefer that body style. I like holding the camera in my hand like a photographer would, but being able to shoot video. I think there's so much power in that. It's so flexible. It's so dynamic. I can run and gun all day, every day, never get tired. It's never too heavy. I don't need any like support rigs or extra systems to build out, spend more time, takes up more space. That's not at all what I want. I want the smallest, most compact rig that can give me the most bang for my buck. And right now, that's the S5 Mark II. So if you've been on the fence and you're looking for something, you're like wondering, is this worth it? I think they're really affordable. I think the used market has the S5 Mark II. I mean, just barely over $1,000. I haven't checked the price recently, but you can scoop them up and find a pretty good deal, because it's a lot of value in terms of what you're paying versus what you're getting. Now, I will say the lenses are bigger. They are bulkier. It's not the end of the world compared to Micro Four Thirds. But if you want truly, truly compact, then yeah, the GH7 is probably a good way to go. Because even if you do the compact full frame cameras, something like the LUMIX S9, it seems like a cool camera. I might pick one up at some point. But no matter how small the body is, you're still at the mercy of the full frame glass. And I really haven't seen anything, L mount full frame lens wise that really lends itself to being ultra compact in the same way that you can get with Micro Four Thirds, because that system has been around so long. There's plenty of super compact lenses with really compact camera bodies. And that is an advantage in certain situations where you want something ultra light, ultra portable, can basically fit anywhere, you can mount it on anything. And that gives you some really cool options when you're shooting, like I do recently, where I'm shooting with two cameras at the same time. And maybe I'll get into, I've done a few videos on what that setup can look like. It's evolved since then in the way I do it. But basically, having autofocus, reliable autofocus in video, and having these cameras small enough allows you to do very creative things where you can basically be two camera operators in one. But that's probably a video for another day. Ultimately, I just wanted to say the S5 Mark II is all it's hyped up to be. It is awesome. It's great value for the price. But if for whatever reason you're still looking at Micro Four Thirds, I'd say the GH7 is probably the best choice for Micro Four Thirds at this time. It's just unfortunate it took so long to get phase detect and a proper camera body that didn't overheat, that does basically everything you would ever want. It is kind of the perfect Micro Four Thirds camera, because I can't imagine how it would be all that much better at this point in time. But it's really a shame that it took so long to finally get it. So I think there's kind of a bittersweet nature to the GH7. It's got everything you would want, but I think a lot of people have moved on at this point in time, especially when there's just so many options from Sony, Canon, Nikon. Blackmagic now has some great cameras that people are really excited about. For me, my most exciting camera is the S5 Mark II. Which is kind of old news at this point in time, but it really is a testament to how powerful that camera actually is, how impressive it is, especially when you can consider how cheap they are to pick up. So if you're on the fence, definitely check it out. Maybe rent it, see how you like it. I find the menus, everything like LUMIX. I love the format, the menus, everything about it, the features that are there. Just a few minor gripes about the S5 Mark II, but that's really it. I really, really am very happy. And I think it does make a nice complement with the GH7. They kind of work hand in hand, each offsetting what the other can't quite accomplish. So as always, right tool for the job. And for me, at this point in time, that's the S5 Mark II and the GH7.